going back to some of the discussions that we had today, essentially artificial intelligence is everywhere. So from driverless cars to machine learning algorithms that improve healthcare. And so AI and its underlying algorithms are really fastly shaping a lot of very crucial processes in our societies. But these technologies can also have a negative impact. They can disadvantage certain communities, minorities, and other social groups. And so there's clearly, and this is something that came up in our workshop today, there's a tension between the rapid pace of the technological development of these smart technologies on the one hand, and our societal preparedness for their impact, both legally speaking and ethically speaking. And so while there is a growing body of academic literature that sort of talks about improving the auditability and the transparency of these algorithms, there is a lack of shared understanding about some of the fundamental issues at the heart of the debate about AI algorithms, ethics, and the law. And so most specifically, as it came up today, around a three-part question, which is what AI-related issues should be addressed by the law, which ones can be covered by ethical frameworks, and how can we make sure that both of these are technically feasible. And so what this roundtable does is that it gathers together 5 outstanding experts from various fields and sectors, as well as you, the expert audience, to share perspectives on these questions. So before going into discussion, I would like to welcome the panelists to shortly introduce themselves and give a little bit of the background of their day-to-day lives. Go ahead, Alan.
Thank you, Corinne. So my name is Alan Winfield. Good evening, everybody. So I'm a professor of robot ethics at the Bristol Robotics Lab. So you may wonder what a robot ethicist does. Well, I mostly worry. So I'm a kind of professional worrier. And maybe I'll share with you a few things that I worry about. But I also do kind of positive work in the sense of doing something about worrying, which is that I'm involved in a number of ethics initiatives, including a big one which is led by the IEEE, that's the Institution of Electronic Engineers Standards Association. In fact, several of us on this panel are also involved in that initiative. And one of the things that we're doing as a result of that initiative is developing new ethical standards for AI. So I hope that that will come up a little bit. Perhaps, Corinne, before I hand over the microphone, I'll share with you a couple of the things that I worry about. If you like, ethical issues with AI. Perhaps my 2 biggest fears are to do with wealth inequality. So I'm very concerned that the wealth that's being created, and of course it's a very large amount of wealth that's being created by AI and automation, is shared by all in society. That's my first, if you like, ethical worry. My second one is about who's designing that AI. And the problem is that most of our AI is designed right now by men, overwhelmingly. In fact, it's not just any men, it's typically young white men. I've nothing against young white men, but the problem is that is dangerous. It means that the AIs are envisioned and designed, if you like, reflecting the values of a very small subset of society at large. So at that point, Corinne, I'll hand on.
Thank you. I'm Monica Beltrametti, and up to 5 months ago, I used to manage the Xerox Research Center in Europe dedicated to AI. And as such, we were in the B2B market with customers in many different industry sectors. And what is interesting that up to a few years ago, our customers were not aware very much of, as you said, the dangers of AI and how biased they could be. But very recently, I think that we had a lot of requests from our customers to be explainable and accountable. And very interestingly, some customers know exactly what they expect, and others are very unclear, and they say, well, it has to be defensible, but what does it mean? Please help me. So very, very diverse set of customers. As I said a few months ago, this was the situation at Xerox. Now the center belongs to Naver. It was sold to Naver, a South Korean internet company, or the South Korean internet company that owns many other companies, including Line. Perhaps you know about Line. And now we are in the B2C market with other issues about AI, also very interesting.
Hi, good evening. My name is Vadhu Shi. I am policy advisor with Article 19. Article 19 is a global human rights organization, and we focus on freedom of expression. At the digital team, what we do is, specifically with respect to AI, is we're trying to figure out how to make artificial intelligence and algorithmic decision-making respectful of human rights and ensure that it actually promotes human rights, because we believe that it does have the potential to also then erode human rights. So the majority of our work is focused on how do we configure legal and policy asks in order to ensure that we're promoting the freedom of expression in particular and also human rights more generally. So we do this at the level of domestic policy. For example, we contributed recently to the House of Lords consultation on artificial intelligence. We also do this through policy research, so we publish policy briefs. And we also do this, as Alan mentioned a bit earlier, at international internet governance bodies like the IEEE and also the IETF.
Hi, I'm Sandra Laughter. I'm a lawyer and research fellow in data ethics at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford. And I'm also a research fellow here at the Alan-Turing Institute. So what I worry about is the ethical and legal implications of emerging technologies on society. Originally, actually, I came from more the surveillance corner and the question of how surveillance methods influence and impact human rights. Nowadays, I focus more on machine learning and AI and the question of how to design systems that are fair, transparent, and accountable. And as I mentioned, I'm also on the IEEE, so I try to have one foot in academia and one foot on the actual policy side to propose something that can be done realistically and practically.
Hello, I'm Paul Nemitz. I was the director in the European Commission in the lead on bringing into a law the General Data Protection Regulation. And now my job as a principal advisor of the Commission on Justice Issues is to look into AI. What are the issues which we can leave comfortably to ethics? What are the issues which may need a law in the area of artificial intelligence?
Perfect, thank you. If I can actually follow up directly on that, and that is the question which has come up throughout this day, but which comes up in the public discourse on a regular basis. And that is, if all of you would be able to speak a little bit to this specific question. So what do you think can be tackled by ethical frameworks, codes of conduct, self-regulatory mechanisms, versus what you think would require more hard regulation or laws?
Well, shall I start?
Perfect.
Oh, yeah, you go first.
Well, I'm on a journey of discovery, and I came here to hear from you what you think the great British and international scientists, academia, the companies, and civil society. But the general principle in democracy is that important things, important issues which touch on individual rights, human rights, or which are very important for society, must be dealt with by law. By a law which comes from the democratically legitimized parliament and lawmaker. And so I would say that the closer AI gets to the political sphere, when we think about elections, bots, chatbots, influencing opinions of people, nudging them in a certain direction without them knowing that it's happening, the more there is an issue of which I would say, sort of on first sight, this is something which can't be left to ethics, but we need law to put in place certain rules. For example, that people in the political context at least know whether a machine speaks to them or writes to them in the social messaging context, or whether it's a human being they speak to. So this is an area where I would say transparency is key. And generally, I would say it would be good if we would know a little bit more about the subject. The problem with AI is a lot of research takes place in a black box behind closed doors. Billions of dollars are supposedly spent on this. But if I would ask you into the round, what have you actually seen of AI? Do you know whether it's a hype, it's a marketing thing, or it's real? And have you been in the laboratories of Google, Facebook, and so on? Well, let's see what the answers are. I have not been, and I think there is an issue of transparency about this new technology. So that's also why I'm here to find out, who knows what, and to understand a little bit more the challenges, but also the opportunities.
I think I have a similar view on that. Like, I'm a lawyer, so the perception of ethics is that, for me at least, that ethics and law are sister disciplines anyway. So I don't think you can really think one without the other. In my view, ethics should come up with the principles that are important in our society that lead the path of really good regulation, right? So law that doesn't consider ethical principles, that's probably not a good law. And if you have just ethical principles that are not enforceable, nobody is going to follow them. So I think it should be a good mixture between both of those things, I guess.
So I'm also a lawyer by training, and so it won't come as a surprise that I think that actually law and ethics inform each other, and I find the distinction between the two or rather the trade-off between the two to be an artificial one. And the reason I say that is because I believe that when we call for ethical standards, the most effective way of ensuring a sound ethical framework around AI is to say that the minimum requirement for that standard is based in international human rights law. And the same way, when we're talking about regulation, the regulation has to be ethical, because as Sandra said, if a regulation is unethical, it's probably not a very good regulation and will probably encounter a lot of problems. So I think there's a closer relationship between the two that than we usually anticipate and than we usually acknowledge. And the ideal situation would be if ethics inform the law and maybe precede the law. But because that's not the case, I think we have this artificial distinction between either or. And I think it's important to have both.
Yeah, I think enough was said about ethics and law, but I will add that I think companies should have a set of values that helps them to take decisions that are consistent, etc. And so ethics is very important within companies. I represent a company, so that's why I'm talking about it. And with respect to law, in my experience, it is very important to have state legislations. But from the experience we have in working with our customers in different industry sectors, it is also very important, I find, to have industry self-regulatory bodies, because they understand really the issues within an industry, and they can also check whether an intelligence system is fair or is biased. And so I think that's very, very important to have also industry self-regulatory bodies.
Thank you. I think that we need relatively little new law. I'm not a lawyer, I'm actually an engineer. I spent the early part of my career doing safety critical systems, and I'd like to introduce you to the idea of safety critical AI. So I think you'll all agree, I hope you'll agree, that if it's an AI that could cause serious harm, so for instance the AI in an autopilot of a driverless car, then that's something that should be regulated. You're not going to be happy with that kind of AI driving, sitting in that kind of car, unless you're confident that that AI has been certified as safe and is subject to regulatory oversight and accident investigation, in fact, if there is an accident. And there are lots of other examples of what I call safety critical AI. So a medical diagnosis AI is safety critical. You might argue that the AI that recommends a loan application is kind of safety critical because financial harm might occur if it makes a bad decision. So, I think there's a category, if you like, a subset of AI systems that do need regulating. But I think it's even more important that the kind of soft governance that I think Monica was referring to is in place. And really that means companies and labs, anybody developing AI should be doing so responsibly. I'm talking about responsible research and innovation. And it's really important that that kind of ethical governance is in place. And not just in place, but transparent. So, if a company says, yes, we innovate responsibly, then my next question is, well, how? If you're not transparent about the process that you use, then I'm not sure that I believe that you are, in fact, innovating responsibly. So I think transparent ethical governance, if you like, is the other side of the coin.
Perfect. Thank you so much for those questions. I want to slightly pivot the conversation to the question of what AI is, because this is something that has come up in our discussion during the day, that a lot of different people, depending on where they work or where they sit or what kind of research they do, have very different operational definitions of what this even means. And we also tend to convolute discussions about algorithms versus discussions about machine learning versus discussions about artificial intelligence proper, if there is such a thing. And I was wondering if each of you could speak a little bit to the extent to which you think that AI is or is not fundamentally different from technologies we've seen thus far. We can start from the middle out. Vadhu Shi, go ahead.
So I think the reason why people are so there's a hype around AI is because it's new technology. Like we saw the same thing with the internet. We saw the same thing with telecom. I guess what troubles most people about AI is the inscrutability of AI. So essentially this black box problem that we don't really know why decisions are made. And another thing that I personally find problematic is that AI is both new and pervasive. So there's no real understanding of the exact implications or how we're going to regulate. Like we're having a whole discussion on how to regulate AI if we want to regulate AI, but it's already widely deployed. And I think that is the problem with AI, but I don't think it's in any other way fundamentally different. I think we can find answers for AI in existing law. I think we can find answers for it in ethical codes of conduct and so on. Which way?
Well, answering your first question about the definition of AI, so should I address this first? AI mimics our brains, the way that we perceive the world, the way we reason, and the way we plan. Okay? And recently, AI has done a lot of progress in the way we perceive the world, especially in computer vision, in how you process imaging, understand images, etc. There are a lot of progress there. There is still a lot to be done to teach AI system to really reason and to plan. Okay, so some of the hype recently comes from the fact that we have done great progress in the perception of mimicking our brain and how we perceive the world. Yes, there is a hype. With respect to transparencies and what you were saying, it is true that for some intelligent systems, we do not know how they take decisions. And it is desirable that in the future we teach intelligent systems to really explain themselves in an automatic way, the way they work. This is not feasible today because research is required to make this happen, but it will be feasible, I'm sure, in the next few years.
I think AI is different to other technologies in at least 3 ways. First of all, I think the autonomous part. is probably one of the most interesting things, because those systems act autonomously. They are not just pure tools like other technologies we have, like using a hammer, using a car, where you actually the master of that thing. So the level of autonomy is something that is new. And in that regard, their voice is getting louder whether this is going to challenge the traditional legal system of liability, because the question is who should be responsible if something fails, if you cannot really if you don't really know whose fault it was, right? So that's a legal problem with regard to autonomy. The other thing is that it is unpredictable. With other things that usually technology, you usually know what you get, so you can foresee what's going to happen. AI is very unpredictable, and you don't have that, which makes it very risky. It has positive implications as well, but it can be very risky. And I think the last thing is, even if you want to tackle those problems, the autonomous side and the unpredictability is you don't know, you don't understand how they're working. So the inscrutability and the opacity of those systems. So even if you come to a level where you understand what's happening there, it's either you can't do it, or only experts are going to understand what's happening there. So it's very hard for normal people to understand what's happening in that system. And I think those are at least 3 points where AI is different than other technologies, and it might be worth thinking if we need additional safeguards to guard against those risks.
Yes, I think it's not automation we're talking about. It's not the classic robot which does what he has been, or she, or it has been instructed to do. And even if it's a complex automation, it's autonomy to some extent. And that is the challenge. And we have seen in the law already, for example, in the famous right to be forgotten judgment concerning Google and data protection by the European Court of Justice, that the companies which now develop AI, they try to get out of the responsibility. In the Google case, Google argued, we are not responsible for the answers the search engine gives, because it's the algorithm doing it. So I think this issue of liability and responsibility, if you have created a program, even if this program afterwards develops in a certain direction autonomously, is on the table. And this is an issue which in law has been addressed already in this judgment, for example, but also in normal civil law. I don't know how it is in the UK, but in many countries on the continent, if you have a dog, and you may well train the dog, but if the dog bites someone, you are responsible. Doesn't matter how well you've trained it or not. And so, we have models which could also apply to AI in terms of, the degree of autonomy. And it's probably a few decades to go until we have reached general AI, so that the dog may not be the right comparator anymore. I would also say that what is new in AI is that it's a technology which is developed behind largely closed doors. We had a little bit divergence of view this morning on the transparency of the research, but by players which are already very powerful and very rich. It's very concentrated. Leadership of AI is basically, as far as I understand, but I'm a newcomer in this area, with very few companies, certainly when it comes to the breadth of research and the ability to integrate different elements of technology into functioning systems. It's maybe 5 or 6 sort of the big American IT companies: Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft. And so AI adds to other elements of market power and also power relating to politics, which these companies already have. They have very deep pockets. They are at the top of the stock exchange in terms of valuation. They increasingly control the public sphere. In America, one speaks already about the automated public sphere. People get their political information these days from Google and from Facebook, rather than reading the good old newspapers. Second element of power. Third element of power, they collect a lot of personal data. They know a lot about you as individuals. Fourth element of power, they will be the masters of AI. There's a lot of elements of power coming together in these companies in a way which we have not seen before. And I think it is important, if we have an academic debate about AI, but also a political debate, that we don't just discuss the political engineering challenge. We have to see the power context. here, and I think Alan already mentioned there is an issue of redistribution of wealth here, but there are other issues also relating to the functioning of the political system. If you think about how important targeting and technology has become, for example, in election campaigns, as we have now seen in the American election. And of course, AI will increase the relevance of technology in elections. And the question which is posed is, do we want to live in a democracy where maybe next election is won by those guys which have the best AI program to nudge each of us to put the cross for the right party?
So thank you for that. That actually leads me to the last question I want to ask the panel, and then we'll open it up for Q&A, which is something we talked about today, is the specific. There's clearly several sectors that are very influential in making decisions about AI development and also what kind of an impact it has on our society. And this panel is actually quite a good cut across from all of these different sectors. So I was wondering if each of you would be able to speak to what you believe the responsibility is of your respective sectors. And for the ease of it, I am going to classify you as an engineer today, Alan, if that's okay.
Sure.
And I would like to start off with you, and then we can move down the line.
Okay, thank you, Corinne. Well, certainly I think that engineers need to accept responsibility for their creations. And just reflecting back on the previous question, while I completely agree with my colleagues, there are some new and interesting aspects of AI. AIs are still engineered systems, and there's nothing mystical about them. They are human, man-made engineered systems, and therefore, in principle, not inscrutable. I mean, there's no reason that we cannot have transparency and explainability in principle. Now, one of the you've given me a chance, Corinne, to mention one of the aims of this IEEE initiative, which is essentially educational. So it's a very ambitious aim, which is to kind of educate and empower all technologists, all engineers, all developers, so that ethics, if you like, are baked in to the whole of the design, development, and application process. That's a very ambitious aim. But in a sense, from a long view, those of you that are old enough to remember the 70s and 80s, and if you were in industry at the time, you will know that it became acknowledged in the 1980s that you couldn't add quality as a kind of add-on. If you wanted to have quality in your business, then every single person in that business had to share responsibility for quality management. I think that we're now looking at the same thing. So in engineering companies, in AI companies, what we need to do is to move to a culture where every single individual in that company, from the CEO, right down to the kind of junior, the intern, if you like, every single one of those men and women equally share responsibility for the ethical, if you like, responsibility of what they're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. So building on what Alan said, as an industrial research center, we are responsible to our customers. And when we deliver systems to them, we have to understand which principles they want to have baked in the system. Okay? And it's our responsibility to understand that before we develop anything. And as I said before, sometimes it's very difficult to get the principles out of our customers because they have done things manually for decades perhaps, and they have forgotten what principles they use. So you have to get it out from them and then bake it into the algorithm, and then more importantly, check the algorithm that in fact it obeys these principles. And all this process has to be transparent and has to be explained to the customer. and the customer has the right to, question and verify themselves, and you cannot just say, sorry, I'm done. You have to be responsible because you are the creator of the algorithm.
So as civil society, we work in the public interest, and you can imagine that for me to answer this question is particularly difficult, because it's not like, we have a particular customer in mind. We first have to think about what does public interest mean and then work towards it. So I think there are three main responsibilities we have. The first is to bring clarity to this particular debate. Like we said in the beginning, AI now means everything, and hence it kind of means nothing also. Because everyone has different ideas of AI in their mind. You may be thinking of a killer robot when I'm thinking of a chatbot. There's no shared language and shared approach when we think about these debates, which end up making them not as constructive as they should be. So as civil society, I think the first thing that we are responsible to do is to bring conceptual clarity to the debate. The second, I think, is to act as a conduit between the different audiences that have an influential voice in this debate. And by that I mean to act as a conduit between technical, policy, and government actors. Because as civil society, this is what we do. We engage with different stakeholders on particular policy issues and work in the public interest. And so we have this unique privilege almost to engage with different actors without being told what to think. And so I think there's a lot of value in what civil society can bring to the debate in terms of exchange of views. And the third is that because a lot of questions around AI regulation and AI law and AI ethics are inherently ethical, our work is particularly important because we work on issues that are also inherently ethical. And what do I mean by that loaded sentence? Is the human rights frameworks with which we engage with on a daily basis imbibe ethical principles. And we have built frameworks in international law that have a grounding in both, in terms of liability, but also in terms of bringing clarity about duty bearers and responsibility. And there's a particular gap between technical and academic research and this human rights framework because it isn't adopted 100%. And so what we can do is actually bring the most useful and the most relevant information from both points and actually make them speak with each other as opposed to over each other.
So I'm a legal academic, and I think in general the role of academia, the responsibility of academia is to deliver objective and independent research. And the aim behind that is to, as you said, contribute to the debates, open up a discussion, which is very important for a democratic process, without having a particular agenda in mind. So the ideal academic would be somebody who sheds light on problems, warns, but in a way that it's not just from the ivory tower perspective, just abstract, but actually thinking about the real implications of the work that they're doing. But I think shedding light at problems and raising voices is not enough. I think academia has also a responsibility to propose solutions in a certain way. So that's the ideal academic in my view. Being objective, being independent, and try to propose solutions without having an agenda in mind.
Yes. For the European Commission, I think there's one side, the economic opportunity, the need to catch up probably with the United States in terms of the intensity and quality of research, but also bringing to market of artificial intelligence applications and technologies in Europe. So it's an issue of growth. It's an issue of industrial policy. But at the same time, there, as many great technologies before, there's a great promise. There may also be, and there are probably also some risks. And so I think the challenge before us is to make sure that we benefit from the great positives of this technology while ensuring that basic constitutional principles, rule of law, democracy, human rights, fundamental rights, but also environmental sustainability, safety, are still very well in place also if this technology is pervasive. And I think we have to deal a little bit with the issue of concentration of power, of economic power, of research power in the hands of a few. That's an issue which can be addressed in part by competition instruments, competition law, and maybe also in some other ways. It's clear that the network effect, which we have seen already on the internet, with this technology may be accelerated. So I think that's one of the great challenges of the internet age. The internet started as something which was very decentral, where everybody was supposed to be empowered by the personal computer. Now we see a huge centralization of processing, cloud computing, also the technology development. Maybe we can spend money on research programs in the future to see that Europe also can contribute again to re-empowerment of individuals and re-decentralization of opportunity.
Thank you. On that note, I'd like to open the floor for questions from the audience. We'll go from front to back. Go ahead. Sorry, Jess is coming with a mic.
Hi. So, kind of on the first question, really.
Wait, is that on? Also, please be advised that this is being filmed.
Might just be me. I might just talk louder during that.
No, for the live stream, it's great if you have a microphone.
Okay.
Also for accessibility.
Okay. So last year saw the production of the Silomar principles, were in theory your ethical framework for researchers that were signed by quite a few people. Do you think they went far enough? And there is a statement in there about not knowingly producing something that we might turn out to be harmful. Can we actually do that yet, or until it's in the wild, like some viruses? We just don't know. So is it a good starting point? Does it go far enough? Should that maybe be our legal framework?
Whomever wants to respond, go ahead. Sandra?
So, from a legal perspective, I think we have, for example, the new data protection framework, which will come into force, has probably something that will satisfy, maybe. I get your point that it's really hard to assess the potential negative implications of a technology very early on. As I understand it, I think that companies have been doing that for a while, but it wasn't obligatory. It will be, as of next year, to at least be more mindful about what companies need to do as of next year when GDPR comes into force. If they're using artificial intelligence and automated decision making, is making a data protection impact assessment. That means they have to evaluate the potential risks and also show some kind of mechanisms or procedures that they put in place to mitigate those things, which is under the umbrella term of accountability, which is one of the governing principles of the GDPR. So I cannot tell you if that will work out in practice. I can just say I think it's a very good step forward in order to at least nudge and potentially force companies to do that, because there will be fines attached if you don't do it.
Thank you. Yes, so the principal funder of this kind of research in the UK is EPSRC, the Engineering Physical Sciences Research Council, and they are really very hot on responsible research and innovation. So there's been a framework for some years called the AREA framework, which stands for Anticipate, Reflect, Engage and Act. And it's a really good framework. I recommend you check it out. And there's a new project which has just started where EPSRC are funding a thing called Orbit, which is a kind of observatory and resource for researchers. So there's a website which you can easily find if you just search for Orbit, O-R-B-I-T, and what EPSRC are now doing is asking reviewers of grants to check that proposals are properly taking into account the need for RRI. So I think that, it's getting there.
Was your original question about the Asimov principles in? Asimov, sorry.
Asimov, that got very confused in the Royal Academy
I just wanted to clarify. I have a slightly cynical answer to that, and that has nothing to do with those particular principles, but and something maybe I should have said in the first round is that the issue with ethical codes of conduct, while they are very important, and while we need them, they're very critical to this debate. The problem is they don't go far enough insofar as bringing about an enforcement mechanism and an actual responsibility framework. And so I think this is why the question of ethical frameworks versus legal frameworks is kind of like a non-question, because while the ethical frameworks can tell us what to aspire to, it's the legal frameworks that actually bring about a responsibility to the ideals that we strive for. So I just wanted to plug that.
Wait, that's fine, that's fine. There's another question there. Yeah.
Thank you. This is a great panel. It's been a really interesting discussion. The thing that struck me, though, in this conversation is that it's at the moment it's still happening on a very a principled level, on an abstract level, and it struck me that there's not currently a sense of urgency. At least I don't feel that from the panel. So I'm also wondering, is that because currently we don't have examples that we can point at? Do we currently not have stories that we can tell of specifically something that went wrong? And once we have those stories, how do we then talk about them? How do we then assess the effects?
I would say there is a sense of urgency. I mean, first of all, the regulation, the data protection regulation, doesn't enter next year. It enters into force in May of this year. And I think certainly governments and corporations are very aware of this, that they have to get ready for this. I think your question about the things which went wrong is, of course, has to be answered with yes. There are already many examples of things which have gone wrong with algorithms and with programs. We don't know whether they were artificial intelligence, but certainly, they were somewhere between automation and autonomy. And I think that's why we have now rather a big debate. We have seen an explosion over the last year of all these ethics codes. And these ethics codes, they're not only, the question is not only the enforcement, the question is also where's the democratic legitimacy? There's one group which does this ethic code, the other one does this. And of course, it's the dream of business to do it all themselves. And if they're in a good mood, they invite civil society also. But if you live in a democracy, there's also parliamentary law. And I think that the fact that, for example, you now have the committee in the House of Lords here looking at these things, it shows that the issue is arriving on the table of the legislator. The European Commission will put a paper on the table on 25th of April. It's very unclear whether this paper will say anything about the need of new law, because the challenge right now is to look at the challenges of AI and to see whether existing law covers these challenges sufficiently. Liability, for example, was mentioned, and it will certainly need some time to identify those points where maybe new law is necessary. But it's important to know that in Congress, for example, in the United States, there are already 2 legislative proposals relating to AI. There is some academic debate about the law and what would be requirements of laws, and also, systems like type approval for AI, like we have it for other technologies. So I would say certainly the level of urgency in academia and also in politics has reached, let's say, the necessary activity, and things are going to happen both in terms of the technology moving forward, but also in parallel, and that is natural and good, awareness of people, and with that also the ability of the democratic system to do what is necessary to ensure the public interest in all this, because that cannot be left just to those who make the money with this.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Wait, can you please wait for the microphone?
Thanks very much for the panel. Very, very interesting. I had a similar worry as to this person earlier about the cinema coming from the Americans. These types of programs that they put into the community and travel into Europe. I was wondering if the law in artificial intelligence in Europe had the ability to defend against such types of interests moving into community sociology. An example would be, someone asked earlier if there would be an example I think an example would be the films, the series of Star Wars. You know, there are like 9 films now. You know, so we have this constant bombardment of a particular sector's interest type in graphics and social evolution imaging. So, you know, what worries me is that we have the framework available to defend ourselves against trends which become over populated, where they get to near the standard of creating virtual prisons for intellectual property because of the exposure to those cultures and trends. Do we have the law available to protect us, and would European law be represented properly in a community where the financial implications are heavily favouring a particular continent?
Perfect, thank you.
So the question was, do we have law in place that defends us against what? Sorry.
Against, trending community imaging components, such as Star Wars trilogies. 9 films, and just can go on and on and on and on and on. Everyone's seeing all these.
If we all stopped watching them, then they would go away.
Yeah, I think we can also take another question, because there were some more in the back, all the way in the back. Jess, if you could.
Hello, thank you for an incredibly interesting panel session. I'm sorry I was late, and apologies in advance if my question covers something that you covered earlier. Just picking up on Vadhu Shi's very perceptive point, I think, about the need for a common vocabulary from which we can actually, all of us as humans, develop responses and debate potential responses to this new technology. To what extent do you think that we need to develop fundamentally or qualitatively different ethical and moral and legal frameworks that are commensurate with different classes of AI? Everything from a search engine algorithm to, so let's say in a few years, a fully conscious or apparently conscious artificial intelligence system, for example. Do you think we need to start distinguishing between the different classes of AI in developing our thoughts and potential responses to them?
Yeah, so I actually agree very much with you, and I think there's something that came out in the discussion today as well, that it's probably smarter to look at the specific areas where AI is being deployed and work from there, rather than having an overarching one-fits-all solution framework. Because I believe that the questions that we worry about, fairness, transparency, accountability, will be different depending on where we use AI. The question of fairness will be different if you use a health algorithm or if you use it for autonomous car. The question of liability will be different in those sectors areas as well. So I guess it would make more sense to look where the algorithm is being deployed and where the actual risks are. So I would actually agree with that. On the ethics side, and I think that's something that came up as well, is the problem is we don't really have consensus on ethics currently, not in a country, not in Europe, not in the world. And even if we had that, it would be changing over time. So, how to do that? I don't have a solution for that. I'm just saying it's a very complicated issue, because ethics and values and the perception of democracy is just constantly changing, I guess.
Wait, Vadhu Shi, you wanted to follow up?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think you bring up a really important point, which is when we think about vocabulary around AI, we usually paint it in really broad strokes. So for example, transparency. When we talk about transparency, it's actually more helpful, I think, to think about it on a spectrum. So the transparency that we require from governments is significantly different from transparency that we require from Amazon. This also matters because there's different grounding in law. So for example, transparency of governments is usually a constitutional concept that comes from accountability, from the duties of governments to be accountable to their citizens in A, B, and C sectors, but that doesn't naturally translate to companies. So I think it's actually more constructive to think of it on a spectrum in terms of the stakeholder that is actually deploying the AI. And that's just an alternative to the sector approach. But I think, yeah, you bring up a really important point. Thank you.
Alan, you wanted to respond?
No, I think you've covered it. Thanks, Vidusha. Yes. Let's have more questions.
Yeah.
Thanks. It's Sian Thomas from the Food Standards Agency. I'm really interested in that specific point because governments are deploying AI in a whole range of ways. Some of them that are not specifically for implementing the legal responsibilities that they have, but to do things to, for example, protect the population. So the transparency frameworks that you're talking about, how do you envisage that they would work across those ranges of things where industry have information and algorithms that could be used by government to protect citizens but don't have to disclose them, whereas government have less money which they're investing in technology to develop things to protect populations, and everything that they do has to be transparent.
Anybody wants to take the question?
I'm not sure I understood what the question was.
Is the dichotomy, the industry on one hand having one set of rules and the government having another set of rules, and the way that the finance aligns with the different levels of transparency and the different rules.
And you're concerned about the fact that the people who are supposed to be in the business of protecting people's fundamental rights are also the one that have fewer financial resources to do so.
Yeah.
Got it.
I mean, I think it's certainly true that we need to, and I absolutely agree with Vidusha that we demand, rightly demand, a higher level of transparency from our parliamentary representatives and from government. And people often ask me, well, what should I do if I'm worried? Well, do the thing that we should all do, which is write to your MP. Make representation. If you're worried about some aspect of AI, write to your MP. That's always a good place to start.
We have a couple of more minutes left, and before we round off, I would like to really quickly ask the panel members if they can say a couple of words about what it is about AI that actually excites them, because I think we've talked a lot about the perils, but I also want to make sure that we cover the promises. Paul?
Well, why don't I start because I've got the mic.
Go ahead.
Okay. So the thing that excites me about AI is that actually the thing that I'm really interested in is not technology, it's people and life in general. And for me, AI is, if I'm honest with you, I'm not really interested in it for its utility. I'm interested because AI and robots are a kind of microscope, a kind of scientific instrument for studying and understanding more about natural intelligence.
Yeah, building on what you said, I mean, technology is technology. Technology has a purpose, and the purpose of AI is to simplify, enrich our lives, and that's the purpose that excites me, not technology just for technology. Yeah. And I think that should be the rule, that technology always should have a purpose.
I'm mostly worried about AI, if that wasn't already clear. But what I am excited about is actually not very exciting at all. It's it's the potential for AI, if it is deployed and developed deliberately, to actually add value to life, to add value and efficiency in populations and for people who actually need it, but with a huge caveat of it has to be deliberate and not in this fashion of everyone's trying to win a particular race.
Yeah, I guess I'm also excited. I'm a bit more excited than you about AI, but I think it has huge potential. I think one of the areas is health, for example. So algorithms being used for disease prediction, for treatment plans, for clinical trials, for drug discovery. These are the things that algorithms are very good at, sometimes better than humans. And I think that's something that could actually benefit society as a whole, where we could use AI for the good, not just to automate for the sake of automation.
Well, I think AI as an enabling technology it can be used for many good purposes. It can help us to overcome intransparencies of technology on the internet. We will understand power relations better. We can manage our cities better. You know, democracy can be revived by AI if it is given this purpose. So I think apart from the question of the ethics in the development process and the law, the question is also, you know, which purpose is it going to be developed for and what is it going to be used for? I can imagine a world which is much fairer, much more opportunity for individuals to understand and to manage their life, much more self-determination if AI is developed for this purpose.
And on that cautionary but positive note, there's 4 people I would like to thank, starting off with all of our excellent panel members. The Data Ethics Group here at the Alan Turing Institute for funding us and making the 2-day workshop as well as this panel possible. The Turing's events team who've been so gracious in supporting us, and you all for coming out and bringing these excellent questions to us today. Thank you so much. I wish we had more time, but I hope you can join me in thanking our panel.